The unforgiving Alaskan blizzard clawed at Ruth Henderson, pinning her injured, freezing body to the snowy earth. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her eyelids heavy with the promise of eternal sleep. Miles from her cabin, hope was a dwindling ember. Then a low, guttural growl vibrated through the icy air. A shadow moved in the swirling white chaos. A large, dark form materializing from the storm itself. Eyes burning. Before I continue, drop a comment telling me where you're listening to this from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. You won't want to miss the ending. The world outside Ruth Henderson's small, sturdy cabin in the Alaskan interior was a screaming white void. It was an early winter, but the kind that felt ancient, merciless. Snow, already waist-deep in the valleys, hammered down from a sky the color of lead, driven by a wind that bit through her thickest furs. At 72, Ruth knew this land like her own calloused hands, and she knew to respect its fury. But even the most seasoned trapper sometimes underestimated the wilderness's sudden, savage moods. She was checking a few traps along the frozen river, more out of habit and a deep-seated connection to the land than true necessity. Her sled scraped over the packed snow, the silence broken only by the howl of the wind and the crunch of her boots. It was on the bend, near a cluster of ice-sheathed spruces, that she saw it, a dark, still lump against the stark white. At first, she thought it was a fallen branch, snow-covered. Then a faint, almost inaudible whimper carried on a lull in the gale. Ruth stopped dead. Her breath plumed in the frigid air. Slowly, cautiously, she approached. What she found turned her stomach with a cold knot of dread and a surprising jolt of raw pity. It was a wolf pup, barely larger than her gloved hand, maybe 3 or 4 weeks old. Its fur was caked with icy mud, matted and stiff. Ribs showed starkly beneath its thin hide, each breath a shallow, shuddering struggle. Its eyes, barely open, were clouded with the dull haze of starvation and hypothermia. It trembled violently, a tiny engine fighting a losing battle against the freezing ground that was stealing its life, one painful degree at a time. It lay utterly still, unable to move, a fragile, dying spark in a world of ice. Ruth had lived a life of steel, knowing the unforgiving laws of nature. Wolves were powerful, wild, meant to be respected from a distance. She knew the dangers, the diseases, the untamed spirit. Her first rational thought was to leave it, to walk away. It was nature's way, a grim but necessary culling. But then she looked at its tiny, desperate face, the way its little body fought to breathe, and something in her, a deeply buried tenderness, broke through the ice around her heart. It wasn't a threat. It was a baby, abandoned, suffering. She couldn't leave it to die alone. Not like this. The decision was made in a flash, driven by an empathy that defied all her wilderness wisdom. It would be a monumental task, a risk. She would have to warm it, feed it, care for it. And then what? A wild creature in her cabin. It was madness. But the whimper, thin and sharp as a needle, pierced her resolve. Gently, so carefully, she scooped the minuscule, shivering body into the inner pocket of her parka against her own warmth. The pup felt like a bag of bones, unnervingly light. It didn't fight. It only shuddered deeper into the heat. The journey back was a blur of driving snow and the fierce, protective thrum in Ruth's chest. Back in her cabin, by the roaring wood stove, she set about her impossible task. Warmed milk dropped slowly from a dropper onto its tiny tongue. A clean, soft cloth for its matted fur. Small, agonizing hours spent simply holding it, pressing its frigid body against her own, willing her warmth into its failing form. She named him Shadow, for the way he seemed to flicker at the edge of life. A few days later, a crackle on her shortwave radio announced an unexpected visit from Norma Cobb, her nearest neighbor, a woman whose good sense was as sturdy as an old spruce. Norma arrived on her snow machine, stomping the snow off her boots, her eyes immediately drawn to the small, dark bundle wrapped in a blanket near the stove. "Ruth, what in the good Lord's name is that?" Norma's voice, usually a calm river, was now a sharp edge of concern. Ruth, cradling Shadow, looked up. "Found him near the river, near Frozen. A wolf pup." Norma's face drained. "A wolf pup? Ruth, have you lost your mind? They carry disease, they'll turn on you. You're just asking for trouble, keeping that beast. You'll regret it, mark my words. It'll be a sad end to a good woman." The words hung in the air, heavy with conviction, painting a bleak picture of the future. Ruth only tightened her grip on the tiny, fragile life in her arms. She knew what people would say. She knew what Glenn Fry, the bush pilot who brought her supplies, would think with his no-nonsense, practical view of the wild. They were right, by all accounts, but the feeling of that tiny heartbeat against her palm was a different kind of truth. Norma's worried words, "You'll regret it, mark my words," echoed in the quiet cabin. But Ruth simply shook her head. Regret wasn't in her nature, not when a life hung in the balance. The days that followed were a testament to quiet, stubborn devotion. Shadow, the small wolf pup, was a creature of pure instinct, still wild despite his weakness. He would cower beneath the bench by the wood stove, shivering not just from the cold he'd escaped, but from a deep, primal fear. Ruth learned to move around him with the slow, deliberate grace of a shadow herself. No sudden movements, no loud noises. She talked to him in a low, gentle murmur. Words meant less for their meaning and more for the soft, calming rhythm they carried. Her mornings began with warming milk, sometimes adding a tiny bit of finely minced dried caribou meat to give him strength. She'd pour it into a shallow bowl and leave it near him, then retreat to a respectful distance, pretending to be busy with her chores. He'd eye her constantly, pupils dilated, before tentatively inching forward to slurp up the liquid. Sometimes he'd hiss softly if she moved too quickly, a tiny, fierce sound from such a fragile body. It broke her heart a little each time, but she understood. He was fighting for his life, and every fiber of his being screamed caution. Slowly, over weeks, Shadow began to regain his strength. His ribs grew less prominent, and a healthy sheen returned to his thick, dark fur. He still kept his distance, never approaching her directly, but the fear in his eyes lessened, replaced by a cautious watchfulness. He would follow her movements with his gaze as she chopped wood or prepared a meal, his head cocked just so. He never chewed on her things, never whined for attention like a house dog. He was always a wolf, even in his smallest, weakest form, carrying the wildness of his kind within him. She built him a small, cozy den by the wood stove, lined with an old wool blanket, hoping he'd find comfort in the warmth. He used it, eventually, but only when she was completely still or out of the cabin. About a month into his recovery, Glenn Fry, the bush pilot, flew in for his monthly supply drop. His plane's roar was a familiar sound, but this time it was met with a new kind of tension in the cabin. Shadow, now much larger, a sleek, dark bundle of muscle and wary intelligence, flattened himself beneath the bench, a low, almost imperceptible rumble vibrating in his chest. Glenn stomped in, shaking snow from his heavy coat, his eyes immediately going to the space under the bench. "Ruth, what in blazes are you thinking?" he boomed, his voice filling the small space. "That's not a house pet. That's a wolf. I told Norma, you're playing with fire. Look at him, all teeth and wild eyes." He pointed a gloved finger. "He's going to tear your chickens apart, then you, when he gets big enough. You can't domesticate the wild, old woman. It ain't right, and it sure as heck ain't safe." Ruth just gave him a steady, unblinking look. "He hasn't touched a feather of my chickens, Glenn, and he hasn't shown me an ounce of harm." She gestured towards the pup, who, despite Glenn's loud voice and pointing, remained still, simply watching them from his shadowy corner. He didn't snarl or lunge. He was coiled, watchful, yes, but not aggressive. Glenn scoffed, shaking his head. "Just wait, Ruth. It's in their nature. They'll turn on you. You'll see." He dropped a heavy sack of flour on the floor with a thud that made Shadow flinch, but the wolf pup didn't bolt. He simply observed, a quiet, contained energy simmering beneath his sleek fur. He wasn't the monster Glenn feared, not yet. He was just Shadow, a wild creature slowly learning that some humans, just maybe, could be trusted. Ruth knew the risks, but in his quiet presence, she found a solace that the skeptics simply couldn't see. The last of Glenn's grumbling echoes faded with the drone of his plane, leaving Ruth and Shadow alone once more in the cabin's deep quiet. The skepticism, the warnings, they were just noise against the steady beat of Ruth's own conviction. She knew what she was doing, or at least she was trying to. Weeks had turned into a month, then a month and a half. Shadow had grown quickly, his puppy clumsiness giving way to a lean, sinewy grace. His dark fur, once matted and dull, now shone with a healthy luster, deep as the shadow he was named for. He was no longer a whimpering, fragile bundle, but a young wolf, full of contained energy. Still, the wildness remained. He would watch Ruth with intense, intelligent eyes, observing her every move, but always from a little distance. He ate the food she left, always cleaning his bowl, but he never sought her touch. He allowed her to clean his den, to lay out fresh blankets, but if she reached out, even slowly, his muscles would tense, ready to spring away. Ruth understood. Trust was earned, not given freely, especially not from a creature like him. She never pushed, never forced. Her presence was a steady, warm constant, nothing more. She'd spend her evenings by the crackling wood stove, the cabin bathed in the soft, dancing light of the flames, the only sound the gentle hiss and pop of burning timber. She'd read old books, sometimes humming a low, tuneless song, just to fill the silence. Shadow would be somewhere in the shadows, often peeking out from under the heavy wooden table, or occasionally venturing to lie by the warmth of the stove, always keeping a watchful eye on her. One particularly frigid evening, the wind outside howling like a mournful spirit, Ruth was settled into her favorite armchair, an old worn quilt draped over her lap. She was lost in the pages of a well-loved novel, the kind that carried her far from the snowbound cabin. The air was thick with the scent of pine smoke and brewing tea. Shadow, having eaten his evening meal, had retreated to his usual spot beneath the bench. Ruth felt the familiar, gentle warmth of the wood stove on her face and the rhythmic beat of her own heart in the quiet. Then she felt something else. A subtle shift in the air, a movement at the edge of her vision. She didn't look up immediately, didn't want to break the delicate spell. She sensed, rather than saw, Shadow emerge from his hiding spot. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, each paw placed with soft precision on the rough-hewn floorboards. He stopped a few feet from her armchair, his large amber eyes fixed on her. There was no fear in them now, no aggression, just a quiet, deep contemplation. He took another step, then another, until he was right beside her leg, close enough that she could feel the faint warmth radiating from his body. Ruth held her breath, not daring to move a muscle. She didn't want to startle him, to break this moment. She kept her gaze on her book, but her awareness was entirely on the wolf beside her. Then she felt it, a soft, firm nudge against her right knee. It wasn't a demand, not a playful bump. It was a gentle inquiry, a quiet test. Slowly, carefully, Shadow leaned his head against her knee. The weight was surprisingly substantial, the fur soft and warm against her old denim. He didn't lick her hand, didn't whine for attention. He simply pressed his large head into her. Then, with a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, he lowered himself to the floor. His eyes, still fixed on her face, slowly closed, and he rested his chin squarely on her foot, hidden beneath the quilt. The silence in the cabin deepened, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the gentle, even breathing of the wolf pup. Ruth's heart swelled with a feeling she couldn't quite name. It wasn't the fleeting affection of a pet, nor the wild awe of a distant observer. It was a moment of profound, unspoken connection. This was a choice. A creature of the deepest wild, after weeks of cautious distance, had chosen her. He had offered a small, quiet act of trust, a deep-earned recognition that went beyond words. She wasn't an owner, and he wasn't a pet. They were two living beings, sharing warmth, sharing a silent understanding in the vast, cold expanse of the Alaskan night. And in that quiet moment, Ruth felt a kind of peace she hadn't known she was missing. The quiet trust forged that winter evening, with Shadow's head resting on Ruth's foot, deepened as the weeks turned into months. He never became a lapdog, or even a typical house pet. He was always a wolf, observant and independent, but he chose to be near her. He'd lie by the stove as she worked, a warm, dark presence, sometimes stretching out fully, letting out a soft grunt of contentment. He responded to her quiet voice, not with obedience, but with a tilt of his head, a steady gaze that spoke of understanding. He would follow her on short walks through the burgeoning spring woods, always a few paces behind, a silent companion. But as the deep snows of winter slowly surrendered to the insistent thaw of spring, a new restlessness stirred in Shadow. He was growing into a magnificent young animal, lean and powerful, his dark fur shedding its winter thickness. The cabin, once his sanctuary, now seemed to contain him less. He began to spend more time outdoors, exploring the forest around the homestead, drawn by the scents and sounds of the awakening wilderness. Ruth watched him go, a pang in her chest, but she understood. His instincts, long suppressed by starvation and injury, were roaring to life. He'd return, sometimes with the telltale scent of fresh game on his fur, his eyes bright with the thrill of the hunt. One spring morning, when the last stubborn patches of snow finally surrendered to the sun and the forest buzzed with the vibrant chorus of returning birds, Shadow simply didn't come back from his dawn foray. Ruth waited. She left his food bowl filled with a generous portion of dried meat and fat. She called his name, softly at first, then a little louder, her voice carrying across the dew-kissed clearing. The only answers were the chirping of sparrows and the rustle of new leaves. Days turned into a week. The food bowl remained untouched. Ruth walked the perimeter of her property, her eyes scanning the tracks, hoping for some sign, some indication. Nothing. Not a whisper. He was simply gone, drawn back to the wild, to his own kind, as she had always known he would be. There were no goodbyes, no lingering farewells, just a quiet disappearance into the vast, indifferent beauty of the Alaskan wilderness. Her cabin felt emptier than it had in decades, the silence more profound without the soft thud of his paws, the gentle presence by the stove. Over the next few months, as summer bloomed and faded, Ruth would sometimes hear them. The haunting, melodic howls of a wolf pack, carried on the crisp autumn air, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, echoing from the surrounding mountains. She'd stop what she was doing, listening intently, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. She understood. Shadow had found his true family. He had found his place in the great, wild tapestry of the land. And since you've made it this far, go ahead and hit that like button. It really helps me keep bringing stories like this. Ruth didn't dwell on the emptiness. She was a woman of the wilderness, and she respected its ways. She had given him a chance at life, and he had taken it. That was enough. Years passed, blurring into the endless cycle of Alaskan seasons. Ruth grew older, her movements a little slower, her silver hair now almost entirely white. She remained fiercely independent, still tending her cabin, still finding solace in the solitude. She hadn't seen Shadow since that spring morning. He was a memory now, a quiet story she kept deep in her heart. Then, nearly 2 years after his departure, a raw, late winter afternoon painted the valley in hues of cold blue and stark white. Ruth was gathering kindling near the edge of the spruce forest when she paused, feeling a familiar prickle of being watched. Her eyes, still sharp, scanned the distant tree line across a wide, snow-covered field. There, moving with silent purpose, a large, dark wolf emerged from the shadows of the spruces. It was immense, powerful, its coat the color of twilight. Its stride was fluid, effortless, born of the wild. For a fleeting moment, its head turned. Its eyes, amber and intelligent, met hers across the expanse of snow. There was a spark of something familiar there, a depth, a recognition that resonated deep within Ruth's soul. She knew that strong, familiar profile immediately. It was Shadow. He paused for only a heartbeat, a silent acknowledgement, then turned his gaze forward, melting back into the dense trees, a dark, powerful ghost slipping into the wilderness from which he came. He was magnificent, thriving, and he was truly, irrevocably, wild. Ruth watched until the last ripple of his passage disappeared, a lump in her throat, a profound sense of peace settling over her. He was free. The late autumn day began with a false promise of quiet. A pale, weak sun had tried to break through the overcast sky, casting a ghostly light over the Alaskan wilderness. Ruth Henderson, though 72, still had the spirit of the land in her bones. She strapped on her snowshoes, hoisted her heavy pack, and set out to check a few of her old trap lines. Not for the fur anymore, not really, but for the simple, profound joy of moving through the silent, cold woods, breathing the crisp air. It was a ritual, a connection to a lifetime spent understanding this wild, beautiful place. She moved with the familiar rhythm of an old trapper, her eyes scanning the tracks, reading the stories written in the snow. The air was calm, too calm perhaps, with an odd, heavy stillness that hinted at a change. She was miles from her cabin, deeper into the valley than she usually ventured this late in the year, engrossed in the memory of old trails. Then it hit. Without warning, as if the sky had ripped open, a sudden violent gust of wind shrieked through the spruce trees. It wasn't just cold, it was a physical blow, roaring down from the mountains, carrying a fresh deluge of snow that instantly obscured her vision. The sky, which had been merely grey, now turned a terrifying, churning white. An unprecedented early blizzard had arrived with the savage speed of a cornered beast. Ruth squinted against the stinging, icy particles, trying to reorient herself. The familiar path vanished under a blanket of swirling white. She pressed on, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, to find shelter. But the wind howled, pushing her, pulling her, robbing her of balance. She was trying to navigate a steep, rocky embankment, a tricky spot, even in good weather. Her foot, searching for purchase beneath the new snow, found only slick, concealed ice. Her boot slipped. Ruth cried out, a short, sharp gasp of surprise and alarm, as she lost her footing entirely. She tumbled, a heavy, ungainly fall down the unforgiving slope, her body twisting. The world became a blur of white and jagged rock. She landed hard, a sickening crunch echoing in the sudden quiet of her own mind. Excruciating pain shot up her left leg, a searing agony that made her teeth clench. Her ankle, she knew instantly, was badly twisted, perhaps broken. Her heavy pack, which usually brought comfort, now betrayed her. It had shifted during the fall, pinning her right arm at an awkward, painful angle beneath her body. She tried to push herself up, to free her arm, to move her leg, but a wave of nausea washed over her. The pain was too great. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of her stoic resolve. The snow continued to fall, thicker and faster, erasing her tracks, burying her. The temperature plummeted with shocking speed, driven by the gale-force winds that screamed through the valley. What was merely cold a moment ago was now a lethal embrace, stripping away her body heat. Her fingers, even inside thick mittens, began to ache with a deep bone-chilling cold. Night was falling fast, a premature darkness hastened by the blizzard's impenetrable curtain. The isolation, always a familiar companion, now pressed in on her like a physical weight. Miles from her cabin, injured, trapped, and rapidly succumbing to the creeping lethargy of hypothermia, Ruth knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that she was in mortal danger. No one knew where she was. No one would expect her back for days. This, she realized, might truly be the end. The blizzard roared, a hungry beast devouring the last vestiges of daylight, plunging the valley into an icy, impenetrable blackness. Ruth Henderson lay huddled against the frozen earth, the snow steadily building a cruel white shroud over her. The searing pain in her ankle had dulled, replaced by a deep, throbbing ache that radiated up her leg, a constant, heavy reminder of her predicament. Her right arm, still pinned awkwardly under her pack, was growing numb, a heavy, unresponsive weight. The cold was no longer just a discomfort. It was a living entity, creeping into her bones, stealing her warmth cell by cell. Her fierce shivers had begun to subside, a deceptive lull that experienced outdoorsmen knew was a grave sign. A strange, fuzzy lethargy began to creep over her, a warm, inviting haze that promised rest, promised an end to the biting wind and the endless pain. Her eyelids felt heavy, too heavy to keep open, wanting desperately to succumb to the sweet oblivion. She fought it. She had always fought. For 72 years, she had battled the wild, the elements, the loneliness, always finding a way. But this was different. This was the wilderness, not fighting, but simply consuming her, slowly, patiently. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, each exhale a visible cloud against the brutal air, each inhale a fresh stab of frigid air in her lungs. She tried to move her fingers, but they felt stiff, unresponsive, like frozen wood. Her mind, however, refused to completely surrender. As her body drifted towards the edge, her thoughts became clearer, sharper, disconnected from the dying physical form. She saw her cabin, warm and inviting, the crackle of the wood stove, the scent of pine and brewing tea. She thought of the little things, the simple, profound comforts of a life lived close to the earth. And then a different image surfaced, pushing through the cold haze. Not a frantic call for help, not a desperate hope for rescue, but a quiet, cherished memory. Shadow. She remembered the tiny, shivering pup she'd cradled against her chest, barely larger than her hand, clinging to life. She remembered his intense, intelligent amber eyes, watching her from beneath the bench by the stove. She remembered the slow, painstaking weeks of building trust, the gentle murmurs she'd offered, the quiet, unspoken understanding that had grown between them. A faint smile, a ghost of warmth, touched her lips. She saw him as he was that evening, years ago, when he had finally, tentatively, leaned his strong, young head against her knee, then settled down, his chin resting on her foot, a silent offering of his trust, the feel of his warm body, the steady beat of his wild heart, a living, breathing connection in the vast, cold silence of her cabin. She hadn't expected it then, hadn't asked for it, and it had been one of the deepest gifts of her life. He was magnificent, a creature of pure, untamed wilderness, and she had loved him for it, for his wildness, for his independence. He was out there, somewhere, living free, exactly as he should be. That thought, a simple, pure acceptance, brought a flicker of comfort to her failing spirit. The warm lethargy was becoming overpowering now. Her muscles felt heavy, heavy as stone. The pain was almost gone, replaced by a sweet, dreamlike numbness. It would be so easy to just close her eyes, to let the snow cover her completely, to finally sleep. The fight was leaving her, replaced by a quiet, profound exhaustion. She felt herself slipping, her consciousness pulling away from the cold, battered shell of her body. Then, through the howling wind, through the ringing in her ears, through the thick, cotton-like fog in her mind, a sound. Not the wind, not falling snow. Something else. A low, guttural growl, deep and resonant, that vibrated through the very ground beneath her. It was close, unmistakably close. The low, guttural growl cut through the blizzard's shriek, a sound that stirred something ancient and familiar in Ruth's fading mind. It was deep, resonant, and urgent, closer than anything should be in this storm-ravaged wild. Her heavy eyelids struggled, then slowly, agonizingly, cracked open, peering through the icy haze of her blurring vision. A massive, dark form materialized from the swirling white chaos. It was huge, powerful, a shadow within the shadows of the storm itself. Her mind, half lost to the encroaching cold, registered a wolf. Fear, a primal instinct, tried to surface, but her body was too weak, too numb to respond. This was the end, she thought. A fitting end, perhaps, to be claimed by the wilderness she loved. Then the wolf was upon her, not with fangs, not with menace, but with a wet, warm nudge to her freezing face. Its nose, cold and damp, brushed her cheek, then her chin, a persistent, gentle pressure. A soft whine, almost a plea, rumbled from its chest. This sound, more than the sight, startled her back from the edge of unconsciousness. The sound was familiar, impossible, yet familiar. The wolf's large head then moved to her shoulder, nudging her, then it began to paw gently at her right arm, the one still painfully trapped beneath her pack. It wasn't a scratch, not a rough movement, but a careful, deliberate action, as if trying to free her. When she didn't respond, couldn't respond quickly enough, it shifted. Ruth felt the soft grip of teeth, surprisingly delicate, on the heavy fabric of her parka sleeve. Not biting, not tearing, but holding. And then a steady, insistent tug. It pulled. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the wolf began to drag her through the deepening snow. Her injured ankle screamed, but the pulling was relentless, measured, a powerful, determined force. Her body scraped against the packed snow, the sharp bits of ice. She was barely conscious, her head lolling, but the movement, the shocking reality of being moved, kept a tiny spark of awareness alive. The blizzard raged, pushing against them, but the wolf, its powerful legs churning through the drifts, was a silent, unyielding engine. Inch by painstaking inch, then foot by foot, it pulled her away from the treacherous embankment, away from the exposed, lethal cold. It pulled her towards a small, sheltered cave she hadn't thought about in decades, a tiny recess in a rock face, almost hidden by thick spruce trees. She used to use it as a temporary camp during harsh winters, long, long ago. How could it know? Finally, the pulling stopped. She felt a blessed reprieve from the wind as she was guided into the narrow mouth of the cave. It was barely big enough for her, but the rock walls offered protection, a slight rise in temperature compared to the exposed blizzard outside. The wolf nudged her deeper inside. Then, with a soft grunt, it lowered its massive body. It lay down beside her, pressing its full length against her left side, the side not pinned by her pack. The sheer warmth of its body was startling, a sudden, living furnace against her freezing limbs. The fur was thick, dense, a barrier against the numbing cold. It began to emit a low, rumbling growl, a continuous, comforting vibration that resonated through her chilled body. It nudged her again, its wet nose against her neck, Then again, its breath warm on her ear, keeping her from drifting back into the dark. The combined heat, the solid, living weight against her, began its slow, agonizing work. A prickling sensation, a sign of blood returning, started in her fingers and toes. It was painful, 1,000 tiny needles, but it was life. The wolf, her rescuer, lay there, a steadfast, powerful guardian. Ruth's eyes, finally able to focus a little, met his. Amber, intelligent, and in their depth, she saw it. Not just a wolf, not just any animal. It was him. Shadow. The pup she had saved, grown magnificent, returned from the depths of the wild to repay a silent, long-forgotten debt. And in that moment, shivering yet slowly, miraculously, warming, Ruth knew she would live. The blizzard finally broke. After 2 agonizing days and nights of unrelenting wind and snow, the sky began to clear, slowly revealing a landscape transformed into a pristine, silent world of white. The sun, weak and pale, cast long blue shadows across the snow-covered peaks, hinting at the vast, profound cold that still held the land in its grip. Inside the small, sheltered cave, Ruth Henderson stirred. She was barely conscious, her body aching, but the searing cold had retreated, replaced by a deep, numbing chill. Her left leg throbbed, a constant dull ache, but she was alive. Pressed against her side, a heavy, warm weight, was Shadow. The magnificent wolf lay still, his breath misting in the frigid air of the cave, his amber eyes half closed, a silent guardian. His warmth had been her lifeline, keeping the deadly hypothermia at bay, allowing her frozen blood to slowly, painfully, begin to circulate again. Miles away, Glenn Fry, the bush pilot, was growing more than just concerned. Ruth had missed her radio check-in, and that wasn't like her. Not ever. Despite the lingering dangers of ice and treacherous winds, Glenn decided to fly his small bush plane over her property, just to get a look. He knew Ruth was tough, but that blizzard had been something fierce, even by Alaskan standards. He circled low, his gaze sweeping over the vast expanse of unbroken snow. Then he saw it. Near the steep embankment where Ruth often checked her lines, a disruption, not just Ruth's snowshoe tracks, which vanished abruptly, but something else. Large, distinct paw prints, leading away from the dangerous drop-off, through deep drifts, towards a cluster of thick spruce trees. He knew those prints. He'd seen them before, near Ruth's cabin, years ago. He landed his plane on a nearby frozen lake, the skis crunching on the ice, and strapped on his own snowshoes, a prickle of unease urging him forward. He followed the prints, a sense of growing disbelief warring with the hard facts before his eyes. The trail led him directly to the small, tucked-away cave. Peering inside, his breath caught in his throat, and the air left his lungs in a silent gasp. There, huddled against the cold rock, barely conscious but unmistakably alive, was Ruth. And nestled beside her, his powerful body pressed tightly against hers, was the enormous gray wolf. Shadow. The creature lifted its head, its intelligent amber eyes meeting Glenn's. There was no aggression, no fear, just a calm, steady gaze. Then, with a soft, almost tender gesture, the wolf leaned forward and licked Ruth's gloved hand. It was a fleeting, private moment, a gesture that spoke volumes without a single sound. Then, as if a spell had been broken, Shadow slowly, gracefully rose to his feet. He glanced at Ruth one last time, a quiet farewell in his eyes, then turned. Without a sound, without a backward glance, he slipped from the mouth of the cave, a dark, silent blur against the snow, melting back into the spruce forest as if he were a ghost. Glenn stood there, utterly speechless, watching the magnificent creature disappear. His face, usually so etched with gruff practicality, was now a mask of profound shock and dawning wonder. He looked at the distinct impression where the wolf's warm body had been pressed against Ruth's, a clear, unmistakable outline in the snow, a silent testament to a life saved. Hours later, after Glenn had managed to radio for more help, Norma Cobb arrived with a small search and rescue team. She found Glenn sitting by a now-started fire in the cave, carefully tending to Ruth, who was wrapped in warm blankets. Norma looked at Glenn, then at the lingering large paw prints leading from the cave entrance, still fresh in the pristine snow. Her eyes were wide with disbelief, her earlier warnings about the beast hanging heavy and hollow in the silent, cold air. Ruth, weak but with a spark returning to her eyes, looked at Norma, then at Glenn. Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from the cold, but clear with an ancient wisdom. "Some things," she said, her gaze drifting to the cave entrance where Shadow had vanished. "You save because you have to, and sometimes that kindness just finds its way back." If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Your support is what brings these stories to more people.